You walk barefoot across marble still warm from yesterday's sun. The air tastes faintly of rosewater and iron. Somewhere in the maze of courtyards a nightingale stops singing, as if it, too, fears to wake what sleeps behind the lattice screens. For a moment, you think you hear laughter, but it isn't joy. It's memory. Before we step deeper into the heart of the empire, take a second to steady yourself. These stories, once whispered in candlelight, are only now resurfacing. If you're listening from Cairo, from Jakarta, from Sao Paulo, or London, let us know in the comments below where you're joining from. The past feels less distant when millions of us around the world lean in together to hear what history tried to bury. And if you want more hidden stories like this, don't forget to subscribe, because what's coming will test everything you think you know about power, beauty, and silence. At sunrise, the domes of Topkapi Palace glimmered like frozen tears above the Bosphorus. From a distance, it was the jewel of the Ottoman Empire, the center of a world that spanned continents. But step closer, and the scent of jasmine and musk gives way to something heavier, wax from hundreds of lamps, incense masking the sweat of fear. Within those walls, time moved differently. Every footstep of a concubine or princess was measured, every breath accounted for by invisible rules older than memory. The imperial harem was not the den of pleasure Western travelers imagined. It was an empire within an empire, a city of women ruled by protocol. Its hierarchy was as sharp as a scimitar's edge. Concubines at the base, odalisques above them. Then favorites, mothers, tutors, and, at the summit, the Sultan's mother, the Valid Sultan, the true architect of the invisible realm. Beyond her chambers lived the Sultan's own daughters, royal by blood, yet prisoners by design. Each morning, before the palace awoke, young princesses practiced their walk in the courtyard of the fountains. 3 steps, pause, turn, bow. Their silk slippers whispered like secrets against stone. They learned the geometry of obedience long before they learned the geometry of stars. Tutors recited verses in Arabic and Persian, drilling grammar and scripture while old matrons corrected the tilt of their eyes. Never too bold, never too soft. Visitors who glimpsed the harem through carved screens wrote of laughter, music, and perfume. But the truth was quieter, colder. The sound that ruled here was the ringing of small bronze bells, signals marking prayer, meals, and lessons. Even joy followed the clock. One Italian envoy recorded seeing the Sultan's daughters playing chess on an ivory board. Their faces were pale, he wrote, and their movements rehearsed, as if each piece were moved by duty, not by will. At the center of this world stood the Chamber of the Mirrors, a hall lined with Venetian glass panels imported at staggering cost. It reflected 1,000 fragments of every passing woman, multiplying her into infinity, and yet, in each reflection, her face looked a little less her own. Here, the princesses learned posture, dance, and the subtle choreography of submission. A mistress named Gulbahar Hatun, famous for her severity, would tap a cane on the marble floor when a girl faltered. "A daughter of the Sultan," she would say, "must move like time itself, inevitable, unresisting." Outside, the empire roared with conquest and trade. Inside, the daughters of that empire learned to vanish behind curtains of etiquette. Their laughter, when it came, was muffled, allowed only during festivals under watchful eyes. Even letters home were dictated, polished, censored before the ink dried. The harem's silence was not absence but strategy, a mechanism that ensured the Sultan's bloodline remained both sacred and contained. And yet, rebellion flickered in the smallest gestures. A misplaced glance at a musician. A poem scribbled on silk and hidden beneath a cushion. There were rumors of a young princess, perhaps Mirima, perhaps another, who once bribed a eunuch for a telescope, daring to look beyond the palace dome. She called the stars her sisters, the only witnesses who could not be silenced. When the Valid found it, the telescope was dismantled, its lenses locked away, and the girl's name erased from official records. By twilight, the harem turned spectral. Lamps cast amber halos across the marble halls, and the murmur of prayers blended with the rustle of silk. Servants carried trays of pomegranate wine and honeyed almonds, their eyes lowered, their voices hushed. Somewhere in the upper gallery, a princess dreamed of the gardens she was forbidden to enter. Outside the palace gates, the city's muezzins called the faithful to evening prayer, but within the walls, another faith reigned, the faith of obedience, the religion of control. From the outside, Topkapi seemed eternal, perfect, divine. But beneath the golden calligraphy and jeweled fountains lay the faint echoes of something else. Women pacing between lessons, the sigh of a forgotten lullaby, the soft thud of a forehead touching marble in prayer. The palace was both cradle and cage, shrine and tomb. It promised protection, yet devoured freedom. And as the moon rose over Istanbul, silvering the domes and darkening the courtyards, one question lingered in the still air. How could a place built to preserve purity become the very forge of despair? Somewhere deep within the harem, a young princess stirred from her sleep, unaware that her every step had already been written. The palace waited for her first lesson in surrender. The palace of silk and shadows had claimed another soul. The candles burned low in the women's quarters, their light trembling against walls painted with gardens the girls would never see. The air hung heavy with amber and smoke. Somewhere, beyond the curtain, a child's voice faltered mid-verse, a single note of hesitation that could change her fate. In the silence that followed, the matron's fan snapped shut. The lesson would begin again. Within the harem, the transition from girl to bride was not a celebration. It was a transformation engineered by ritual, a process so refined, so methodical, that it blurred the line between ceremony and indoctrination. The Ottomans called it terbiye gelin, the bride's education. To outsiders it sounded harmless, a courtly custom to prepare young women for marriage, but to those who endured it, it was the slow dismantling of identity. Each princess's training began months before her arranged marriage, when the imperial astrologers set a date auspicious for alliance and submission alike. At first came the purification. The chosen girl, often no older than 14, was isolated in a chamber washed daily with rosewater, its latticed windows sealed to keep out the city's noise. Her tutors would visit at dawn, whispering verses about obedience while she sat cross-legged on embroidered cushions, palms up, gaze lowered. A document found in the Topkapi archives, dated 1623, described the beginning of this ritual. She shall speak only when spoken to. She shall greet her elders with silence. Her laughter must be prayer, her breath gratitude. Every gesture became discipline. The girls practiced walking in measured circles, taught to move with a serenity that denied their own pulse. They were taught to kneel not only before God, but before the husband-to-be, a man chosen by strategy, not affection. Among the few names that escaped erasure was Fatma Sultan, daughter of Sultan Ahmed I. Her story, pieced together from letters and physician reports, reveals the hidden anatomy of the ritual. Fatma was educated, precociously so. She spoke Persian and Arabic, studied the Quran alongside astronomy, and copied poems of Rumi in delicate gold script. Yet, when her betrothal was announced, those talents became irrelevant. Her worth was no longer measured by intellect, but by submission. The first phase was silence. From dawn until evening, Fatma was forbidden speech beyond ritual formulas. Yes, mother. As Allah wills. I am grateful. The matron who oversaw her training, Gulizar Hatun, recorded in her private log, the girl hesitates before each reply. I see the storm behind her eyes. Fatma's resistance was subtle. A delayed bow, a question asked twice, but it was noticed. The punishment was swift. 3 nights of fasting, isolation, and the confiscation of her writing tools. When speech was gone, they went after her thoughts. The harem scholars introduced a book known as the Risale-i Teslimiyet, the Treatise on Surrender. Its verses, drawn from medieval Sufi ethics, extolled the virtues of yielding. The wife is the moon. She shines by her husband's light. Each girl had to memorize entire passages, reciting them aloud before a panel of older women. Any sign of emotion, a tremor in the voice, a tear, was marked as spiritual impurity. Sometimes a eunuch would strike a gong to mark the hour of self-reflection. The girls knelt in front of polished brass mirrors, forced to stare at their own reflections while repeating lines of submission. One European visitor, a Venetian doctor smuggled in to treat a palace fever, wrote in his diary, "They call it self-purification, but it resembles a trial by silence. Even their eyes forget rebellion." Fatma's training intensified as the wedding neared. She was taught the gestures of service, how to pour wine without sound, how to disrobe with ritual modesty, how to avert her gaze at a man's voice. A day before her betrothal oath, she was taken to the Hall of Stars, a chamber painted with constellations, where older women demonstrated the ritual movements of the bridal night. The girl who once traced Orion in her manuscripts now repeated gestures of obedience under the cold glow of candlelight. Witnesses noted her trembling hands. Gulizar Hatun is said to have whispered to her, "A princess is not born, she is carved." The second phase, called Ruh Temizli, cleansing of the soul, was psychological. Fatma was made to copy passages from theological treatises onto parchment until her fingers blistered. Each stroke of ink was a confession, each word an act of surrender. If she hesitated, the parchment was torn, and she began again. The act resembled prayer, but felt like erasure. And then came the tests of devotion. Twice a week she served her father's favored concubines, washing their hands, arranging their veils, and feeding them dates before they attended the Sultan. This, the matron said, was to teach humility. But the symbolism was cruelly precise. The princess was trained to serve those who had replaced the motherly love she would never know again. By the final week, Fatma's reflection no longer startled her. The girl who once argued with tutors and debated poets had vanished, leaving a calm, unreadable face behind the veil. Palace physicians recorded her heartbeat as irregular, faint, yet disciplined. On the eve of her wedding, she was allowed to write one final letter. It was addressed to her mother, the powerful Kusum Sultan. Only a fragment survives, smudged and incomplete. If obedience is virtue, then what becomes of truth? The rest was torn away. When dawn broke, the bells of the harem rang not for prayer, but for ceremony. The courtyard shimmered with silks and gold, but behind the ornate screens, the newly trained brides waited in silence. They had learned how to smile without meaning it, how to bow without breaking. The empire's future marched forward on their small, steady steps, daughters of conquest, taught to vanish for the sake of the throne. And somewhere, as the procession began, a single candle guttered out in Fatma's chamber, its smoke curling upward like the last whisper of a thought too dangerous to speak aloud. Outside, Istanbul blazed like a crown of fire. Lanterns floated down the Bosphorus, and the sound of drums rolled through the city like distant thunder. To the crowds, this was a night of triumph, the marriage of the Sultan's beloved daughter, a promise of alliances and peace. But within the gilded heart of Topkapi Palace, another sound trembled through the walls. The slow, uneven breath of a young girl preparing to vanish into duty. The palace's courtyards glowed with torches and perfume. Courtiers feasted beneath silk canopies, raising golden cups to the empire's glory. Musicians played flutes that seemed to mimic the night wind, and every face that turned toward the palace dome believed itself witness to splendor. Yet behind those walls, the celebration's echo met only silence. The princess, Fatma Sultan, 15 years old, sat before a mirror that no longer reflected her, dressed in bridal silk so heavy it stifled movement. gold-threaded embroidery coiled around her wrists like chains. Before her, the matron Gulizar Hatun adjusted the folds of the gown. "The Empire watches through your eyes," she whispered, voice low, trembling not from pity but from ritual precision. "Tonight, you are not a girl. You are the oath itself." Fatma said nothing. Her lips moved in silent repetition of the prayers she had been forced to memorize, the du'as of obedience, verses twisted from scripture to sanctify submission. The candles around her trembled with the night wind, casting long shadows over the chamber of purity, where even the marble seemed to absorb her fear. The wedding procession began at dusk. Eunuchs led her through corridors lined with rose petals and incense. Musicians played soft melodies from Persia and Andalusia, songs meant to soothe but heavy with foreboding. At the threshold of the bridal pavilion, the air changed. Cool, still, almost holy. The walls were covered with tapestries of conquered cities, stitched scenes of kneeling kings and broken fortresses. Every image reminded her of the purpose of this union, not affection, but dominion. Historians who later uncovered fragments of this night wrote of it in clinical terms: the consummation of alliance. But the letters of one handmaid, smuggled decades later into a Venetian convent, reveal the truth behind those euphemisms. "When the candles were dimmed," the letter reads, "she looked as if she wished to dissolve into the air. The air itself seemed to pity her. In the inner sanctum, the princess waited alone. Her hands rested upon her lap, trembling beneath the embroidered veil. Around her, jars of burning myrrh filled the air with a scent that dulled the senses. Physicians had prepared a tonic laced with poppy oil to calm her, a common practice meant to steady the spirit. But nothing could steady a heart that understood it was about to be conquered in the name of peace. When Kara Mustafa Pasha, her groom, entered, the silence thickened. He was older, a man of the battlefield, his armor replaced by ceremonial brocade. Records describe him as solemn, respectful, but unyielding, a servant of empire before all else. To him, this was not cruelty but duty. Yet even he hesitated at the sight of her, pale and motionless as carved ivory. The witnesses withdrew, leaving the door sealed. What followed remains shrouded in fragments: medical notes, whispered testimony, and one short entry in a court physician's log. Her pulse weakened after the ritual. The bride neither spoke nor resisted, tears unending, applied balm to wrists. The euphemisms concealed more than they revealed. For the empire, the ritual had succeeded, the treaty sealed, the loyalty embodied. For Fatma, it marked the beginning of an exile within her own body. In the following days, she did not speak. Her attendants noted she would sit by the window for hours, staring at the Bosphorus as if waiting for something to return. Perhaps the self she had lost. The physicians called it melancholia virginalis, virginal melancholy, the same diagnosis given to countless princesses before her. The treatment prescribed was devotion, prayer, fasting, and silence. But silence, once learned, does not end. It echoes. Through the decades that followed, other daughters of the empire would walk the same marble corridors, whispering the same vows beneath the same domes. Each would be led to her own night of silence, each required to sacrifice the self for the throne. Some vanished into legend, others disappeared entirely, their names erased from the genealogies that shaped Ottoman glory. Yet, among the archives, in the margins of forgotten ledgers and prayer books, traces of defiance survive. Small, deliberate mistakes in embroidery patterns forming words like sabur, patience, or özgürlük, freedom. Fragments of poetry hidden within Quranic commentary, lines written by trembling hands. A bird that learns to sing in a cage still remembers the sky. As centuries passed and empires crumbled, these threads endured, reminders that beneath the layers of ritual and obedience, the hearts of these women still beat in secret. Fatma Sultan's name faded from chronicles, but her silence became legend, her story whispered by servants who had seen the candlelight die in her eyes that night. Outside, the city slept. The torches of celebration had burned down to ash. Inside the bridal pavilion, only one flame remained, flickering in the draught of an unseen door. The empire rested, content that another alliance had been sealed. But the palace walls, heavy with memory, knew better. They had heard her scream, soft, almost inaudible, but enough to haunt the marble forever.